This video is for pre-calculus. I call it Lab 8, working with special angles and quadrantal angles lab. And you need to have your chart or your table with you as you do this. And I'm going to do some of the problems with you that we did in class, and I'll try to do some hit and miss of this lab to help you out. So the first one, number one, is in this diagram. The ordered pair xy is where the point of the terminal side theta intersects with the unit circle. So we're looking at this point right here. And if theta is negative pi over 3, so it's negative because it's coming from this direction. And you have to look at that and say, okay, I'm in quadrant 4. They want to know the value of y. So they're looking for the sine of the angle in that quadrant. I know that sine in that quadrant is negative, and I know the reference angle of negative pi over 3 is the same as saying pi over 3. So I look at that and say, okay, pi over 3 is the same as 60. What's the sine of 60 degrees? Well, 60 degrees is radical 3 over 2, and it's going to be a negative radical 3 over 2 in the fourth quadrant. So that would be choice D. Okay? Number 2, in this diagram of the unit circle, the ordered pair xy represents a point where the terminal side intersects the unit circle. So now we're over here in quadrant 2. And they said the angle was 3 pi over 4. So this is 3 pi over 4. This angle comes from here to here. So we're going to use our trick that we used, was we're going to call this 180 instead of pi, 4 pi over 4. We're going to use that denominator. And then 2 pi is going to be 8 pi over 4. When I see that, my reference angle is the difference here. So the difference between 4 pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4 is pi over 4. So we want to know the values of x. So we're talking about cosine. The reference angle is pi over 4. I know quadrant 2, the points are negative positive, and since cosine is my x, it's going to be negative. And when I look at my table, that's going to be negative radical 2 over 2. So that's going to be choice A. All right, let's come back up to 3. Now here, when people start doing squares, so when we square the sine of an angle, we put the 2 right next to the trig value. This is the same thing as saying sine of the angle squared. So that's how you're going to need to write it. So they said if f of x equals sine of x squared, then f of pi over 2 equals, so I'm going to write it like this, f of pi over 2, which is 90 degrees, is the sine of pi over 2 squared. And I know the sine of pi over 2 is 1, and 1 squared is 1. So that's going to be choice B. So a lot of the times when people ask me for help on this, they just don't understand how the squares work. So now that you know, when we go and do some of these. I'm going to skip around and start doing some that are a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to go to 5. So 5 is if f of x equals 4 cosine of 3x, what's f of pi over 4? Sorry, there's a line here. So I'm going to do f of pi over 4 equals 4 times the cosine of 3 times pi over 4, which really means I'm doing f of pi over 4 equals 4 cosine of 3 pi over 4. So you've got to figure out basically what the cosine of 3 pi over 4 is, and then we're going to multiply it by 4. So I'm going to draw a picture. And again, 3 pi over 4, we're going to use the trick that this is going to be 4 pi over 4. 8 pi over 4 is over here. So if I come over here, 3 pi over 4 is going to be in quadrant 2. So I'm pi over 4 away. So cosine of 3 pi over 4 is the same thing as saying the cosine of pi over 4, but cosine is negative in that quadrant. Okay? So when I look at my table, that's negative radical 2 over 2. So in this spot, I'm kind of running out of room, so I'm going to come down here and erase it. F of pi over 4 is going to be 4 times negative radical 2 over 2. And think of that as 4 over 1. I can see that these can cancel out. So it's going to be negative 2 radical 2. So that's for number 5. I'm sorry I'm in 6. Okay. Now we're going to do something with 6. And with 6, what I'm going to do is actually, when I plug it in, sometimes you're going to notice when things are quadrantal angles. So let's kind of write down our quadrantal angles. So I know this is 0, this is pi over 2, this is pi, this is 3 pi over 2, and again, there's this 2 pi. You're more apt to see 0 than 2 pi. But here it says they want us to do f of 3 pi over, f of pi over 2. So when I do 6, okay, I've got f of pi over 2 equals the cosine of 3 pi over 2, because 3 times pi over 2, that's 3 pi over 2, plus the sine of pi over 2. I can tell immediately that these are quadrantal angles, so all I have to do here is just kind of plug it in. The cosine, I know down here my point is 0, -1. Cosine is 0 here. So I said, oh, the cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0, plus, so this is down this way. The sine of pi over 2 is up here, which is the point 0, 1, and sine is my y, is 1. 0 plus 1 is 1. And the more you push yourself to do this type of thing, the easier it's going to get for you. It's just to practice this and look at your table. Let's try 7, so that we'll have this page pretty much done. So 7 is find the value of 4 pi over 3. Again, you could convert to degrees all the time, but I remember doing this thinking this is taking forever. So do my trick. Use the same denominator, 3 pi over 3 and 6 pi over 3, and 4 pi over 3 is going to be here in quadrant 2. I'm pi over 3 away, so it's the sine of pi over 3, but I know the points here are negative, positive. Guess what? Sine is still positive there, okay? And when I do this, okay, if sine is positive, oh, I just made a mistake. This is 4 pi over 3. So this is going to be all the way down here. So let me erase that. I hate it when I do this on a video, but hey, we all make mistakes. So 4 pi over 3, let's stop what I'm doing right here. 4 pi over 3, I didn't even count, so I apologize for the mistake. This is going to be 3 pi over 3. I said that correctly. This is 6 pi over 3. But 4 pi over 3, if I count, comes all the way down here in quadrant 4. My mistake. So the reference angle is still pi over 3. It's still sine, but sine is negative down in quadrant 3. So this is going to be negative the sine of pi over 3, which is the same as the sine of 60. And the sine of 60 is, it's going to be negative radical 3 over 2. So that's going to be choice B. Okay? So I'm going to skip around a little bit. I'm going to go, because a lot of these are similar. So I'm going to see if I can find some here that have the reciprocal functions. So I'm going to skip all the way to number 18. So 18 has to do with cofunctions. So the one thing I want to remind you about cofunctions is that cofunctions are complementary. And when I say cofunctions, I'm talking about cosine and sine. I'm not talking about the reciprocal functions. And complementary means they add up to 90 degrees. So the sine, the cofunction to sine is cosine. The cofunction of tan is cotan. And the cofunction of secant is cosecant. Just so you know, that's what we're talking about, cofunctions. And so it says, what's the value of x if sine of 60 equals the cosine of x plus 10? All I need to know is that the sine of 60, and if we remember our table here, the sine of 60 degrees is equal to the cosine of 30 degrees because they both add up to 90. All right? And I know the sine of 60 degrees, all right, the sine of 60 degrees is radical 3 over 2. I know the cosine of 30 is radical 3 over 2. So they match, and that's what it's supposed to happen. So if this is supposed to be 30, then that means x has to be 20 degrees to make those match. Okay? That's how cofunctions work. So there's some expressions with cofunctions. Then we're talking about undefined functions. Undefined functions mean that if you have something undefined, is that if it's in a fractional form, the denominator you cannot divide by 0. So if you take the denominator and put it equal to 0, you're telling me when that function is undefined. So when I do 1 minus cosine x equals 0, So cosine of x equals 1. So I'm saying, okay, what value of my angle that if I did the cosine of it would be 1, and the cosine of, in this case, is going to be 360, or 0, would be my answer, because I know the cosine of 360, which is the same as a 0 angle, is going to be 1. That's how you do these. Let's look at 21. If I want to know if it's undefined, you take the denominator, put it equal to 0. So basically I'm saying when is cosine 0? And if I look at my quadrantal angles, I know cosine is 0 at 90 degrees, or pi over 2, and at 270 degrees. So I look and say, oh, 90 degrees is there. 270 would work as well. Okay? Let's look at 22. For which value of theta is this expression undefined? Take your denominator, put it equal to 0. So I know that tan of theta has to equal 1. If I know my table, I said, okay, I know the tan of pi over 4, or 45 degrees, is 1. So theta is going to be pi over 4, which is going to be choice B. Okay, so this is what this page is kind of with undefined. And then they're having you practice these true and false, which I think these are all good. The people who are going through this and really making sure they can do this and looking at their table and trying to remember how these work are actually feeling like they're getting this better. So let's try 38. Evaluate cosine of 180 degrees squared plus the cosine of 0 squared. And then I just either look at my table or try to remember. I know that the cosine of 180 is over here on the left on my table and over here. So that's negative 1, 0. So that's negative 1 squared. And the cosine of 0 is the 0.10. So that's 1 squared. 1 squared plus 1 squared is going to, or 1 plus 1 is 2. That's how you do these. And you're going to go through and do each one of these. So the students that I've been helping are like, okay, I'm starting to get this. I'm starting to get this. So let's practice some on this page where you're just evaluating. A lot of these are quadrantal. I mix in between degree measurement and radian measurement so that you can practice both ways. I would make cards for your values so that you can kind of do these quickly. So I'm going to start doing what I call ugly cousins, or your reciprocal functions. So let's do cosecant. Let's do number 53. So they want to know the cosecant of 3 pi over 2 minus a secant of pi. Well, I do know that cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine. So I'm just going to write like this one. 1 over the sine of 3 pi over 2 minus 1 over the cosine of pi, because they're reciprocals. And then put in what they are. And the sine of 3 pi over 2 is my y value. And my y value, so it's going to be 1 over negative 1 minus, and the cosine of pi, I know, is negative 1. So this ends up being, I have negative 1 minus 1, or negative 2. Okay, so that's what I have for 53. Oh, sorry, negative 1 plus 1. So this is going to be a 0. My fault. It's a negative, a negative. I did that the other day when I was helping somebody too. I'm sorry. So this is equal to 0. I'm glad I caught myself. Let's do 54. The cotan of pi over 2 is the same as saying 1 over the tan of pi over 2 times tan of pi. So then we're just going to fill in. The tan of pi over 2, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that's undefined. Well, so I told someone, you can say, okay, that's 1 over undefined. 1 over undefined is really 0. And they're like, I don't get what you're saying. So then I said, well, what if I did this? You know that tangent is sine over cosine. So I know cotangent is cosine of pi over 2 over sine of pi over 2. Let's write it that way instead. And then I'm going to multiply it by the tan of pi. Okay, maybe this will help. Oops, sorry. Maybe this will help a little bit. So when I do the cosine of pi over 2, that's 0 over the sine of pi over 2 is 1 times the tan of pi, which I know that pi is 180 But I know that 180, that slope is 0, so this is 0. So I really have, because 0 divided by anything, I have 0 times 0 is 0. So maybe this will help a little bit better. Or if you remember, if you haven't something, if it's undefined and you flip it, it's 0, okay? Let's try this one, secant squared of pi. So I have 1 over the cosine of pi squared minus 2 times 1 over tan of pi over 2. Now, this is the same situation as what we did. You could write this as cosine over sine because it's cotan. So I have 1 squared is 1, cosine of pi squared. So I go, okay, cosine of pi is negative 1 squared. So you're squaring the top and the bottom. Minus 2 times, I know this is undefined. It's 1 over undefined. So this is 0. So I have 1 over negative 1, which is going to be negative 1 minus 0, or negative 1. So I've done quite a few of these on this lab. If you have any questions where you keep going and practicing these, please have your table with you, and hopefully this will help.